Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk for a few minutes about let me just, one moment, let's see if I can get the slideshow to come up. We're going to talk just for a few minutes about social, emotional, and moral development, and we're going to talk about a couple of the major theorists in this arena. So in doing so, we're going to talk about the development of identity, self, and a sense of morality. So we're going to start with Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. We're going to move on to James Marsh's theory of identity, which kind of builds upon Erikson's stages. And then we're going to talk about Piaget's theories of moral development, as well as Kohlberg and Gillian's theory of moral development. So starting with Erik Erikson, he was very much influenced by the stage theories that Piaget developed, and he really wanted to look at how one develops their affective psychosocial sense of self. So he looks at the lifespan, so the view and takes the view that changes are going to happen throughout one's life from birth to death, and that research is required to fully understand this human development. So he proposed a psychosocial theory, and this is the only major theory of development that includes the entire lifespan. And so for Erikson, the most important force driving human behavior and development of personality is social interaction. So he believes that from birth to death, those social interactions play a significant role in how we develop as human beings and our sense of self and our sense of identity. He then took that idea and he, through his research, he came up with 8 developmental stages through this lifespan that each is defined by a conflict that one encounters that has to resolve. And satisfactory resolution of this conflict is necessary for healthy development to occur. So here are the 8 stages very quickly, also outlined in your readings this week. But as you can see, it goes from infancy to retirement. And the stages in infancy have a lot to do with just being cared for and developing a sense of trust. So this has a lot to do with direct care from the adults, knowing that your needs are going to be met, you're not going to be neglected, and developing trust versus mistrust of others. Toddler has a lot to do with developing a sense of autonomy and being able to take some independence and explore the world. And this is when children are trying to learn self-control. This is when setting parental limits is important, understanding the word no, but then also understanding that toddlers have to exhibit some free will. Otherwise, they might feel regret and sorrow if they use that self-control inappropriately. So again, this is about sort of fostering autonomy with this age group, but also understanding that they still need limits and boundaries, but done so in a caring way that still makes them feel autonomous. As they go into preschool years, they are also beginning to explore, to take initiative, to feel some empathy for others. This is really important. So again, this sense of initiative to be fostered versus guilt if one feels that this sense of initiative has been quashed by others or is being denounced by others. In elementary age, this is when children really want to sort of be law-abiding and doing things correctly in comparison to a standard, which makes sense, right? Because, they're entering, this is school age now, so you are being set to standards. And so feeling industrious and feeling like you can meet those standards is really important versus feeling a sense of inferiority if you are unable to meet those standards. Adolescence is a really important time for developing a sense of identity. Who am I in relationship to others? So this could be related to one's sexuality, but it can also be related to one's sense of self in terms of who they want to be in life, where they stand in relationship to their peers. So this is a really important time where children are comparing themselves to others and to a standard, and either feeling, strong in their identity or feeling confused in their identity. As young adults, through your, adulthood, young adulthood, like into your 20s and 30s, it's very important that we develop a sense of intimacy with a partner, or to be able to give and receive love. And this is also a time period where long-term commitments begin. So intimacy versus isolation is a stage that one would enter in this time period. If you are able to achieve those relationships, you would feel a sense of intimacy, but if you are not, one might feel a sense of isolation. In middle age, one is really focused around being a productive individual and being able to have a career, being able to provide if they have a family. So this is an important part of feeling having generativity versus if you don't feel this sense of generativity, your life is not going where you had in mind for it to go, or you are stagnating. This can be a very frustrating time. So this is sort of thinking about your life's purpose in terms of professional life, but also just being able to provide for family and where you want to be at this age. Retirement, those 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and up, this is about sort of looking back over your life and either accepting it with integrity or not accepting it and feeling a sense of despair. So having a sense of acceptance as it was lived, and the relationships and people involved, versus a sense of despair if the life that you reflect upon is not one that you are willing to accept. So Erickson says these are the stages. Again, a lot of modern developmental psychologists sort of are moving away from developmental stages and looking at things in terms of stages, but still it's important to think about sort of how we progress in our lives and some of the relationships, how they sort of define our sense of identity. So really, just sort of thinking about what is the role of identity development, how do others that we interact with, from our caregivers and our parents in those very formative years to our peers, and then to our own families that we develop and our own children in our later years. How did each of those sets of interactions with people help us develop a sense of self and identity? So that's Erickson. Application, when we think about being a teacher, working with kids, we're really working in these initiative, industry, and identity stages. So going back very quickly, we're talking preschool, elementary, and adolescence, initiative, industry, and identity stages. So if we're working with that young group, thinking about providing choices, and this kind of gets into some of your other readings too, that you're going to talk about too when we think about behavior management, but important to offer choices and a sense of self-determination, being tolerant of mistakes. Mistakes are normal and natural and they're part of a learning. So having tolerance for that versus intolerance, which can, again, foster a sense of guilt. Industry is important as well, helping students set goals, achieve realistic goals, giving them a sense of purpose in industry, allow and support opportunities to be independent. So again, this kind of gets back to Piaget too, allowing, activities that foster independence in industry. So that could be, again, your project-based learning, choices in what you're doing, students as leaders in the classroom. You can think of ways that students can be leaders, however small. It could just be through class activities, having someone passing out papers, having table leaders. But industry is really like letting the student have those opportunities to be independent and be leaders. And then finally, thinking about identity, how can we provide positive role models in the sense of developing identity? How can we give them resources to solve personal problems and interpersonal conflicts? So interpersonal conflicts are going to be really big when you're working with kids of all ages. So how can we help with developing a sense of care and a sense of empathy with others? But be tolerant of fads. So knowing that in this identity phase, kids are going to be, every day coming in with a different sense of identity and self, and they're going to be, following fads, following trends. Be tolerant of that, and if they don't offend others or interfere with your teaching, be especially tolerant of that, because that's a normal sense of development of that identity. And then giving students realistic feedback about themselves. So, again, I really feel like it's important that you help demystify students. So, don't dance around things. Be realistic in the feedback you give them, but you can do that in a way that is also kind. You can do that in a way that gives them the tools to improve and doesn't destroy them, but it's still realistic. Don't feel like you have to hide feedback. Okay, so these are great applications of Erikson's theory in the classroom. Okay, the next person is James Marcia. James Marcia really thought about Erikson's theories, and that especially that identity versus role confusion in adolescence, and built upon that. James Marcia is thinking about that identity theory and how we develop our sense of identity, and has four particular stages that one can go through in learning who they want to be as a human being. So this could be, not just, this could be professional identity, so thinking about our career aspirations, what do we want to be? It could be our sexual identity, who do we want to love, who are we attracted to physically. It could be our identity as a friend, identity as a human being. There's just many different ways we can think about identity, but in doing so, James Marcia said that we also encounter conflicts, and that this is part of development of identity. So there are 4 stages. The first stage is called identity diffusion, and this is basically when you have no commitment to a career or belief system, and you're not actively looking to have a commitment. So you don't commit to a career or belief system, and you're also not really worried about it. You're not really seeking to figure that out. Foreclosure is when you have a commitment to an occupation or belief system, but it's not based on your own personal dealings with it. It's really based on what others have told you. I think about this a lot for kids, right? Because kids often adopt the beliefs of their families and people around them that tell them what to believe. And I think that's really normal for kids. But then when they hit that adolescent and adulthood stage, hopefully they're wrestling with this a little bit more. So it's not just about what others want them to be or how to think, but they make those choices based on what they have personally wrestled with and dealt with. So if your mom was always a teacher and they say, I want you to be a teacher, then, that's identity foreclosure. I'm just going to be a teacher because that's what someone told me to be. Moratorium means we haven't made a commitment, but we are actively exploring. So this is kind of the uncomfortable stage. Again, cognitive dissonance is paramount here. Actively exploring is a great thing. The moratorium is not necessarily a bad stage to be in. It's uncomfortable, but it means someone's actually trying to figure this out. And then identity achievement is when one has made some choices, has really kind of gone through that moratorium stage, has wrestled with it, and made choices about what they want to become, either occupationally or in terms of their beliefs, and it is a self-choice. So this is, identity achievement is where we hope all of us end up. But, certainly we can go back and forth through moratorium and achievement throughout our lives. It doesn't have to just be at this one part of our lives. We are constantly wrestling with our beliefs. So that's James Marcia in a nutshell. So when we think about sense of self, a self-concept is basically the picture of yourself. How do you see yourself? When you think about yourself, what attributes do you give yourself? So me, I might think about my physical appearance, what I look like, but also what are my hobbies, what is my profession, what is my family like, what are my beliefs. These are all things that feed into self-concept. Self-esteem has more to do with our opinion of ourselves. So do we like ourselves, or do we really not like ourselves? Do we feel confident, or do we feel inadequate? So that's self-esteem. We can have multiple concepts of self, and it can be based on different areas of our life. So we might have high self-esteem when it comes to academics, but we might have low self-esteem when it comes to our social skills and our relationships. Or it could be the opposite. You could be extremely popular, right, but have very, very poor grades. So your self-concept and self-esteem can vary depending on the arena and depending on what you're looking at about yourself. So you can have a global self-esteem, but you can have a self-esteem that changes depending on what we're talking about. So development of self-esteem, our opinion of ourselves, our peers have something to do with it. We're always comparing ourselves to our peers and then being told by our peers, whether or not they admire us or not. Parents can have an influence on that. The other two ideas is big fish, little pond. So if you are a big fish in a little pond, then maybe in your arena, you are sort of the big man on campus. So some of you may experience that in high school where you are sort of the star athlete, but then you get to college and you're a little fish in a big pond. All of a sudden, you're not the star athlete. In fact, maybe you're not even the best. Maybe you're not even one of the better ones. You are a little fish in a big pond. That can have a big effect on our self-esteem as well. Okay, so encouraging self-esteem, kind of knowing yourself and your own biases. I think this is important. Being intellectually honest with yourself, having clear goals for the teacher and the student, valuing cultural diversity, and then providing that safe-to-fail environment, which we're going to get into more as we talk about motivation. But we want to find ways that value all students in multiple ways. So, not just finding different ways to value them academically, but also through other aspects of other gifts or talents that they have to offer is also a great way to encourage self-esteem. So think about, how can you do that in a classroom? How can you value all students when you have a content area to teach and you have grades to give? How can you provide opportunities for students to develop good self-esteem in your classroom? That's a hard one, right? So I'm going to skip Piaget because I don't want this to run too long, but this is also discussed in your readings this week. But I will say Piaget did have stages of moral development in addition to stages of cognitive development. And one of the theorists that really was influenced by Piaget is Kohlberg. Kohlberg was really interested in moral development and posed in his research, interviewed male adults and posed some ill-defined problems, and then wanted to see how at different ages and stages people would respond to the dilemma. So this is one example dilemma, the case of Hines and the druggist. So Mr. Hines' wife is dying. There's one drug that will save her, but it is very expensive, and the druggist will not lower the price so that Mr. Hines can buy it. What should he do, and more importantly, why? So this is an example of a moral dilemma. So they were judged not according to the respondent's position to either steal the drug or not, but really based on the reasoning. So why did they feel that that Mr. Hines should steal the drug or not steal the drug? And that's how he developed his theories. So he said that we go through 3 major stages. The pre-conventional stage is really about sort of that younger stage where we don't want to get in trouble. We want to avoid punishment. We want to be obedient. We want to garner favor with others. So you see that a lot with kids, right? They don't want to get in trouble or do something wrong. And it's also about, what can I get? So if I do this for you, if I scratch your back, you scratch my back in exchange of favors. Conventional has to do with sort of this global idea of being a good boy and a good girl, and also that there are rules and laws in place and we must follow them. You see that a lot in the elementary ages, in the adolescence. It's sort of a black and white. We follow rules. Post-conventional has to do with sort of more of developing an autonomous sense of morality. So it means that, we have a universal ethical principle. We make social contracts. We don't necessarily follow rules if it means that it goes against sort of our ethics that we have personally grappled with. So people in the post-conventional stage might say that Mr. Hines should steal the drug because it's more important for his wife to live than to worry about, a crime. So it has to do with breaking rules potentially if it means that you are answering a higher calling. So that's post-conventional. So Kohlberg got these stages through interviews with adult males, and some criticism of his theories is that moral reasoning is that the same thing as moral behavior. So answering these questions if you were Mr. Hines, would you really do that? Would you really steal, even if you feel like maybe it's correct to steal? So that's one question. It may be different to say you're going to do it, but would you actually behave that way? Would you do that? There were also some questions about how the way that he did his testing and how reliable his tests were. There were also some questions about the validity of his model. And then there was a challenge that his theory was biased against women because he did not take into account the differences between men and women. So this is where Carol Gilligan comes in. She was a contemporary of Kohlberg's and worked with him, and that was one of her critiques. She said it did not take into account a different sense of morality of women, and women in Kohlberg's tests would score lower. So she said that women have a different sense of morality of care, where they're focused on interpersonal relationships and well-being of others. So she developed sort of her own take on the conception of morality, and said that in the beginning, in stage 1, it is all very ego-driven. We're very interested in our own, what we can get to benefit. And it's the reference is to the self-interest and individual survival. But stage 2 has to do with, being referencing oneself is to others. So we're focusing on social participation. We have responsibility for protection of dependent of others and giving of ourselves, self-sacrifice. And then stage 3 is morality of nonviolence. We are referencing both to ourselves and to others. And so we're focused on independent arbitration of conflicts. And so basically this idea is that women do have a sense of care that is very strong, a sense of nurturing, this idea that women can be mothers, even from little girls, have that sense of nurturing, that sort of giving of oneself to the point of excluding one's own needs. So Gilligan really wanted to point out that men and women may behave differently in this moral code because of either how they were brought up or their own innate beliefs. And then some theorists have added to this and said, really what we can take from this is that this is really dependent on all kinds of situations and not just women and men, but it's just an example of there's just many different ways to think about morality. So it doesn't have to be this one way. So how do we promote this in our classroom? How do we promote moral and pro-social development? We want to encourage, acknowledge, and reward this behavior. So if you have a child that shares with another child, we want to make sure we reward that. We want to positively reinforce those good behaviors that really show compassion for one another and empathy for one another. We want to discuss why some behaviors are inappropriate. Yes, we have to do that even with our high schoolers. We need to talk about why it's important that we have respectful dialogue and not bash someone else for their beliefs. We want to engage students in discussions of moral issues and dilemmas. So we actually have to practice this, not just tell them, but actually have them practice these kinds of discussions so they can develop some compassion and empathy, but also think about these universal ethical principles. Model moral and pro-social behavior and expose them to good role models. Again, role models are important. Finding role models that students can relate to is going to be especially important in this way. Encourage students to take the perspectives of others and encourage them to try to have empathy and pro-social behavior, and then taking diversity into consideration. So having respect for cultural differences as well as different beliefs. All of those things are important to consider. So that's the end of the slideshow. I hope you think about this. Think about, as a teacher, how can you encourage moral and pro-social development in your classroom?